Alright guys, so this lesson is going to cover photosynthesis, and instead of splitting this one up, we're just going to cover it in one lesson. I do think that photosynthesis will be easier after we have covered cell respiration, because some of the same concepts that we saw with cellular respiration are going to be present in photosynthesis as well. And so most of the time students are pretty familiar with the idea that cellular respiration and photosynthesis are opposites. This is something that in freshman biology we hit pretty hard. We don't really go into the details of cellular respiration and photosynthesis, but we do at least cover the concept of the fact that they are opposite reactions. So as you're filling that in, you can see that we essentially have the same compounds, but they are now on opposite sides of the arrow. So this time CO2 is going in along with water, and in cellular respiration those were products. And then we also have light going in. So before we had a catabolic pathway and we were releasing energy in the form of ATP. Here you can see that energy is on the reactant side, and so photosynthesis is going to be an anabolic pathway. And in the case of photosynthesis, our products are going to be glucose and oxygen, and these of course were the reactants in cellular respiration. So the big picture here, the big idea is that photosynthesis is using energy from the sun. We could call that light energy or radiant energy or solar energy to turn water and carbon dioxide into food, essentially. So we could say that as carbohydrates. We could say that as organic compounds. We could simply say glucose. But the purpose of photosynthesis is essentially to make food. Now, oxygen is going to be released, but it is not the purpose of photosynthesis. The purpose is to make the food, and then lucky for us, because we need to breathe it in, oxygen is also going to be a product. Now, photosynthesis is essentially the reaction that is necessary for all life. Because in order for living things to survive, they have to make energy. In order to make energy, they have to have food. And so photosynthesis is the process that makes food for both plants as well as everything that has to eat. And so this particular reaction is taking place in the chloroplast. Now, I do want to clarify between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. We know that only eukaryotes have mitochondria and chloroplast. Now, that does not mean that prokaryotes cannot do photosynthesis or they cannot do cellular respiration. They can. There are photosynthetic bacteria. There are single-celled organisms that are bacteria that can do cellular respiration. So when we say chloroplast and mitochondria for these processes, that would only be in a eukaryotic cell. These processes can take place in prokaryotes. It would just be within the cell as a whole. It would not be within a particular organelle, okay? And so we're going to take a look at the chloroplast and its structure before we move into the actual processes of photosynthesis. So this is a cross-section of a leaf, and these cells here that are called the palisade parenchymal cells, okay, and we also have the spongy cells here. This is where you're going to have a lot of your photosynthesis taking place. Okay, so this is called the mesophyll, which is the middle layer of the leaf, and that's where you're going to find a lot of your chloroplast, and that's where you're going to see a lot of your photosynthesis happening. So when we're talking about photosynthesis, it's mostly going to be taking place in the leaf of the plant. Now, something else we're going to talk about are these stomata. So you can see these little holes. This would be the underside of the leaf, and these stomata are little holes or pores that they open and close. There's guard cells here, and the stoma is where the CO2 is going to come in and the oxygen is going to go out. So this is going to be our site of gas exchange, and so we're going to see this word mentioned at some point as well. All right, so when it comes to the structure of the chloroplast, kind of like the mitochondria, this was covered in the cell parts and organelles, so just a little bit more detail here. We do have a double membrane. This also supports that endosymbiotic theory like the mitochondria does. So we have the outer membrane and the inner membrane. Now this time, instead of having the foldings of the cristae like you saw in your mitochondria, this time we see these little stacks. And so each, what I like to call them is stacks of pancakes, because that's what they look like to me. And so your thylakoids are your individual pancakes. Okay, so there's a thylakoid, there's a thylakoid, and then they come in stacks called grana. Okay, so granum would be one stack, grana would be multiple stacks. And so these are just little membrane structures. And so once again, by having these smaller membrane structures, we're increasing surface area for things to happen. So like in cellular respiration, we're going to need to know the big picture of what's going in, what's coming out, and where it's happening. And so we're going to be referring to the thylakoids or the grana. And then around our pancakes is a liquidy syrup, and that's called the stroma. Okay, so essentially we have a single pancake, a thylakoid. We have a stack of pancakes, a granum, and then you have the syrup around the pancakes, and that's called the stroma. And so as we go through, we will talk about where these events are taking place. Now, with cell respiration, we started in the cytoplasm and moved into the mitochondria. Here in the process of photosynthesis, it's all going to be inside of the chloroplast. And so the reason that the plants are able to do photosynthesis and that we cannot is because they have these pigments that we do not. Okay, so inside the chloroplast are pigments, which are just light-absorbing molecules, and the main pigment involved in photosynthesis is chlorophyll. There's actually two different types, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. They absorb slightly different wavelengths. You may remember on your electromagnetic spectrum you have different wavelengths, and when it comes to visible light, those wavelengths range from red all the way to violet. And so that's where you get words like infrared and ultraviolet. So those are just the colors in your electromagnetic spectrum that make up visible light. And so chlorophyll, in general, is mostly going to absorb the violets and the blues and the reds, and they reflect green. So this right here is why plants are green, is because they are reflecting that green color. This is also why, if you think about your activity that you did in the very beginning of class, plants do not grow under green light, because in order to do photosynthesis, they have to absorb light. And so if you have a plant exposed to a green light, then they're going to reflect that rather than absorb it. Now, chlorophyll is not the only pigment. There's also some pigments called carotenoids. They're called accessory pigments. And this may make you think of carrots. And so carrots are orange, and so your carotenoids are going to be red, yellow, orangey. They also are going to be absorbing light, and they're going to be passing the energy that they absorb to those chlorophyll molecules. So this graph here is just showing you the different pigments. Okay, so the peaks here represent the wavelengths of light that they absorb. So you can see that chlorophyll A here is going to be absorbing the violets and the blues. Chlorophyll B here is more in the blue range. Your carotenoids are going to be in these areas. And so it's just kind of showing you they're all going to be absorbing light, but they absorb slightly different wavelengths. All right, now I'm not sure what happened to the picture here, but one thing we need to understand about photosynthesis is something called a photosystem. Okay, and photosystems are just a collection of pigments. Okay, so these pigments are organized into clusters, and within a photosystem we have chlorophyll, we have those accessory pigments that are also going to be absorbing light, and we have something called an electron acceptor. Now, we've already seen this concept. We saw this in cellular respiration. An electron acceptor is something that's going to carry electrons, and when it does that, it's going to be energized. Okay. Now, there's actually two photosystems, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. They were named from the order they were discovered, not for the order in which they are in the processes. Okay, so don't let that confuse you. We're actually going to start in photosystem 2, and we're going to move to photosystem 1. So they were named based on discovery, not function. All right, so this is just going to be kind of an overview of what's going on. Okay, so chlorophyll is going to absorb light. That's where we're going to start. Now, when the light is absorbed, light is energy, and that light energy is going to be transferred to electrons. So we know that electrons are also energy. Essentially what they're going to do is they're going to be raised to a higher energy level, or they are going to get excited. So when the electrons get excited, they're going to move from one photosystem to another. Now, in the process of moving from photosystem to photosystem, just like what we saw in cellular respiration, as the electrons move, hydrogen ions get pumped. And so through that process, we're going to generate some ATP, and we're going to generate some electron carriers. Now, here you can see something called NADPH. This is very similar to NADH. It just has a phosphate. Okay. Once again, electron carriers carry energy. ATP is energy. Now, photosynthesis as a whole is not an energy producing process. Okay, the ATP that we're generating in photosynthesis is going to be used in photosynthesis. So in order to get ATP for the cells to use, that's what cellular respiration is for. Okay, so we do see some ATP production, but this is not to produce energy for the plant cells. Okay, this is purely to produce energy to be used in photosynthesis. Okay, remember, this is an anabolic pathway, so energy is going in and not coming out. Okay, so as a whole, any energy that is made is going to be used. So the plant is not gaining any energy from the process of photosynthesis. What they're gaining is food. So once we get these energy molecules are going to be used to make the sugars. So first, electrons get excited. Electrons moving helps us make some energy molecules. Energy molecules are going to help us make carbohydrates. And so we're actually going to break these processes down into two main stages. We have the light dependent and the light independent. So kind of like what we saw with cellular respiration, what you need to know more than anything is big ideas. Okay, so here we're going to have two different processes. We're going to have the light dependent reactions. What you need to know is what's going in, what's coming out, and where is it happening. Okay, so in the case of light dependent, obviously the name kind of gives it away. This is where we're going to see light going in. Okay, water is going to go in, and ATP, NADPH, and oxygen are coming out. Okay, so notice in the light dependent reactions we are not making sugar, we are making energy molecules, and we're releasing oxygen. Okay, now this particular process is happening in the pancakes or the thylakoid membranes. This is where you'll find those photosystems. So to kind of give you a bit more detail, okay, the pigments in photosystem 2 absorb light. So you've got the pigments in those photosystems, which are chlorophyll and accessory pigments. When the light hits those pigments, the electrons get excited. And like we mentioned earlier, they're going to move. Now, they are moving toward an electron carrier. Okay, that's what's kind of driving the process. And so what's going to happen is they're going to pass through an electron transport chain, just like what we saw in cellular respiration. As the electrons move through the ETC, hydrogen ions are going to get pumped and it's going to store energy. Okay, so the electrons get excited, they pass from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. And here's a big idea for photosynthesis. Okay, now once the electrons are gone, they're gone. So in order to keep this process going, we need a source of electrons. And in the case of photosynthesis, our electron source is going to be water. Okay, so at the end of cellular respiration, oxygen was the final electron acceptor. The whole reason electrons moved was because oxygen was there waiting on them. Okay, now at the end of the electron transport chain in cellular respiration, oxygen was going to be combined with those electrons and some hydrogen ions, and that is how we produced water in cellular respiration. In photosynthesis, the opposite is going to happen. Now, water is going to be broken. Okay, so water is going to be broken into electrons, those hydrogen ions, and oxygen. So what's going to happen is, as those electrons move through the ETC, the hydrogen ions, after water is broken, the electrons are going to move. They're going to keep moving. As long as water is available and it's broken down, electrons can keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. The hydrogen ions that were in the water are going to get pumped, and oxygen is simply left over. Okay, so this is just a byproduct that is not needed. And so this right here is why oxygen is a product. So where does the oxygen come from? The oxygen comes from the water. Okay, this is why if you do not water your plants, they are going to die, because if you do not water your plants, they cannot do photosynthesis. All right, if they can't have water, then they can't continue this process of the electrons getting excited and moving. Okay, so water is necessary because it's a source of electrons. So once again, in the light dependent, what we're going to do is light is going to come in, electrons get excited and they move. Water is broken to keep those electrons moving, and oxygen is simply given off as a byproduct. It's not necessary, so the plant releases it. And that's a huge benefit for us. Okay. So at this point, we're not done with the light-dependent reaction. So as the electrons pass through the ETC, we're going to see some ATP produced, just like what we saw in cellular respiration, except for this time it's called photophosphorylation. Light energy was used to make ATP. So hydrogen ions get pumped, they flow through ATP synthase, some ATP is made, but whatever the plant makes here, they're using in a later process. So the plant is not gaining ATP from photosynthesis. Now, the pigments are going to get re-energized, okay, in photosystem 1, and the electrons are going to end up with our electron carrier here, NADP, and it's going to become NADPH. So once again, those electrons are moving in the form of an H. We add that on, we are reducing NADP, and now this is an energy molecule. Okay, so in the process of the light-dependent reactions, we're making some ATP, and we're making some NADPH. Both of those are going to be energy molecules. So this is a picture of what it looks like, and I know it looks really, really complicated, but here's the big ideas. Okay, what's going into the light-dependent reactions? All right, first off, light is going in. Okay, so light goes in to photosystem 2. It excites the electrons. Okay, the electrons are passing through an electron transport chain, and as you can see, we have some energy produced here. Okay, the electrons get re-excited. They end up with NADP forming NADPH. Okay, so what's going in? Light. Okay, another thing that's going in is water. Water is going to be our source of electrons, and when water gets broken, the electrons move, hydrogen ions get pumped, and oxygen is just going to be left over. So light and water go in, oxygen, ATP, and NADPH come out. All right, now this is what we call a non-cyclic flow. Okay, the flow is going to go from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. Once again, we get ATP, we get NADPH, and we get oxygen. This is your typical pathway. There is an alternative called cyclic, where they're just recycled through photosystem 1. It does produce some ATP, but you don't get the NADPH or the oxygen. I don't really know if it's good or bad for the plant, but most of the time we're going to be looking at this non-cyclic flow. Okay, so non-cyclic is better than cyclic. All right, so kind of an overview. Okay, so far all we have done is we have made energy molecules. Well, we are now ready for the light-independent reactions, also known as the Calvin cycle. And this is going to look a lot kind of like the Krebs cycle. It's going to be cyclical in that whatever we start with is what we're going to end with. And so at this point, this is where we're going to be making sugar. Okay, so this time CO2 is going in. The energy molecules that we made in the light-dependent reactions are going in, and we are using that to build the sugars. All right. So if we put the combination of the light-dependent and the light-independent reactions, what we are going to get is that big reaction for photosynthesis. Now this time we're now in the stroma. So we are in the sugary syrup, which is the liquidy stuff around the grana. Okay, so the light-dependent took place in the thylakoids. The light-independent is taking place in the stroma. So we're going to kind of talk about it in terms of 3 phases. Phase 1, we have fixation. And carbon fixation is when we add carbon to something else. Okay, so the carbon, our carbon source, which by the way, this is how the sugars are made, this is how all of the tissues in the plant are made. We are carbon compounds. Okay, this is why we have to have carbon compounds, and this is how these carbon compounds are made. So this is a super important process, photosynthesis is. So first, carbon gets fixed, which means it gets added to something else. So the CO2 is where we're getting carbon from. Carbon dioxide is our source of carbon. Okay, so the C's that we have in glucose, C6, are coming from the CO2s that are being taken in by the plant. So the CO2, which is not really considered an organic compound, is going to be fixed or added to other compounds to form organic compounds. Okay, so the sugar or the sugar that it's going to be fixed to is called RUBP. So the CO2 is attached to a 5-carbon sugar called ribulose bisphosphate, and the enzyme that catalyzes this is called RUBP carboxylase. Now, I think this is notable because it says it's the most abundant protein on Earth. Okay, without this enzyme, life would probably cease to exist. Kind of an important thing here. So carbon dioxide comes in. It's going to be attached to a 5-carbon compound called RUBP, and that's accomplished by an enzyme called Rubisco. okay? Now, at this point, we have these compounds that are going to immediately break up, okay? These 6 carbon compounds are going to immediately break up, and then they're going to be energized. So this is where the reduction phase is. Remember, Leo the lion says grr. Oxidation is a loss of electrons. Reduction is a gain of electrons. So when we reduce something, we're energizing it. And so those compounds that are made are going to be energized by ATP and NADPH. Remember, these came from the light-dependent reactions. And they're going to form G3Ps. We actually saw the same molecule in glycolysis, okay? And so this is essentially going to be the building block of our sugars, okay? We're going to produce these 3 carbon sugars called G3Ps. Now, what's going to happen next is the RUBP is going to be regenerated. And so most of those molecules that are made are going to form the RUBP. The CO2 is going to bind to it. It'll be energized, broken down, back to RUBP. CO2s come in, bind to it. Now, what we need to understand is that out of these molecules, we're getting 1 G3P. For every carbon dioxide that goes in, we're getting actually 2 G3Ps, 2 3-carbon compounds. So I want to show you here in the Calvin cycle, it's kind of like the Krebs cycle. So in this case, it's showing 3 CO2s coming out. 3 CO2s is going to give us 1 G3P, okay? Here's what you need to understand. What's going in, what's coming out. So in the Calvin cycle, or the light independent reactions, carbon dioxide's coming in. It's going to be bound to RUBP, and then these compounds are going to break down. Here we have the reduction. We have them energized with ATP, okay? We have them energized with NADPH. There's some more ATPs. Now, some of those molecules are coming out to make glucose. Most of them are going back to form RUBP, okay? So carbon dioxide comes in, it's fixed to RUBP, it breaks down into 3 carbon compounds, they get energized, some come out to make glucose, the rest end up making RUBP, okay? So this is why it's cyclical. We're going to end with what we started with, okay? But as this CO2 comes in, we're creating these G3Ps, and those are going to get joined together to form glucose. So just kind of as a summary, it takes 6 CO2s to produce 1 6-carbon sugar. So if glucose is C6H12O6, that's why when you look at your overall reaction, you have 6 CO2s going in, and that produces 1 glucose molecule. Now, not all of the sugars are going to be available for us, okay, because some of the sugars are going to be used in the plant. The plants do cellular respiration just like animals do, okay? The plants have to make ATP for cellular processes just like every other organism. So the plant is going to use some of those sugars. They're also going to store some sugars. So when we talked about carbohydrates, we talked about starch was sugar storage. They also have to build their cell walls, which is cellulose. That is also a carbohydrate. So some of the sugars are used by the plant. Some of the sugars are stored by the plant. And so this is how we get it. When we eat a plant, we get those sugars that are either stored as starch or that are in the cell walls of cellulose. Okay, so that's how we get sugars. Mostly we get it from the starch. So this right here is a great overall picture. Okay, once again, big ideas. What's going in, what's coming out, and where is it happening? So let's start over here with the light-dependent reactions. Okay, in the light-dependent reactions, light is coming in and water is coming in. Remember that water is our source of electrons. What's coming out? We have oxygen and we have energy molecules. Okay, so in the light-dependent, light and water go in, oxygen and energy molecules come out. The oxygen gets released, the plant's done with it, no more from oxygen. Now, why do we need water? Water was a source of electrons to keep the process going, okay? Where are we? We're in the thylakoids, the pancakes. So once again, light dependent, light and water go in, oxygen and energy molecules come out. Now, to actually make the sugars, we need the light independent reactions. This is going to be in the sugary stroma. CO2 is going in, along with the energy molecules that we made, and glucose is coming out. Okay, that's going to be our big picture. Carbon dioxide goes in, molecules get energized, glucose is going to be our product. All right, so photorespiration. Okay, let me start by saying photorespiration is bad. Okay, so we know that photosynthesis is an absolutely necessary process, but just like cell respiration had some alternatives, there are some alternatives that you can see in photosynthesis. It's not going to be a perfect process. It's not always going to happen the same way in every plant every time, okay? So photorespiration is a bad thing for plants. Now, what happens is the rubisco, that enzyme that binds CO2 to RUBP, it can also bind oxygen. So if carbon dioxide is low in concentration, and you'll find this in areas that are really hot and dry, what will happen is rubisco will bind oxygen instead of carbon dioxide. Now, the problem with that is if rubisco is not binding carbon dioxide, there is no food, okay? There's also no ATP produced. And so what's happening is you have dry climate, you have hot conditions, stomata are closed, so CO2 is not coming in, food can't be made, energy can't be made without the electrons from water. And so this is a bad thing for plants, okay? Now, the reason we're talking about it is because plants have some adaptations. And some plants, we call them C4 plants, okay? Now, the other plants, the plants that we talked about earlier, are usually considered C5 plants. And that's because the CO2 was fixed to a 5-carbon RUBP. Now, as an alternative to avoid photorespiration, plants that are often in hot and dry climates, what they're going to do is they're going to fix CO2 to a 4-carbon compound, and that's where you get C4 from, called PEP instead. Now, what that does is the CO2 joins up with the PEP, and then it stores these compounds in those cells in the middle of the leaf. So what they can do then is at night, whenever it's cooler, they don't have to worry about leaving their stomata open. They will release the CO2 within the plant, and that way they don't have to worry about the temperature and the lower CO2 in the atmosphere. They don't have to worry about stomata being closed. So they fix the CO2 to something else, they store it within the leaf, and then it releases CO2 as needed, okay? So this enzyme doesn't do the photorespiration, it doesn't bind things to oxygen, and so these C4 plant adaptations reduces photorespiration, it keeps the CO2 high and available, and it allows the plant to continue making food, okay? So not all plants, a lot of your plants are going to be C5 plants, they're going to bind that CO2 to RUBP, but as an adaptation, especially plants in hot, sunny areas, they may fix it to PEP instead. And then another adaptation you can find in plants are what are called CAM plants. Now the CAM plants stands for, it's a word called like crassulation. It's a group of plants like cacti or succulents, but it's called like crassulation acid metabolism, and I could be completely destroying that C word. If just know that it's a name for a plant group, like in terms of taxonomy, it's a group of plants. But this stands for acid metabolism. And so what they do is also in response to a very hot, dry climate. You'll find a lot of these plants like in desert-like conditions. They actually keep their stomata closed during the day. They intentionally close their stomata because what can happen is when those stomata are open, not only do they get gases in and out, but water is lost. Okay, transpiration is when water evaporates through the stomata of plants. So plants in a desert area where there's very low moisture, if they keep those stomata open, they're going to lose water all day long, and it's probably going to kill the plant. And so what they do is they keep their stomata closed during the day. Now, when they open them at night, that's when they fix the CO2. They fix it into acids, and they store that CO2 in acids. And so that way, during the day, they release CO2. So as those light reactions are happening, they don't have to be bringing in the CO2 at the exact same time. The CO2 has been stored. They can keep their stomata closed, and the CO2 can be released as needed. And so once again, you'll find this in your succulent plants like cacti in really hot, dry areas. Now, what you really need to know is that there's some adaptations for plants. Photosynthesis is not going to be exactly the same in all plants, okay? There will be adaptations that go along with this major process to account for things like light and moisture levels. All right, a little bit more about evolution. Photosynthesis did evolve first in prokaryotes. This is what actually produced oxygen in the atmosphere, and so cellular respiration really didn't exist until the atmosphere was rich in oxygen. And so the prokaryotic photosynthetic pathways were the foundation for the pathways that we see to get to today. And these photosynthetic prokaryotes are most likely the ancestors to chloroplasts, like in terms of the endosymbiotic theory. And that is going to wrap up our photosynthesis notes. Now, what I want you to know is that you need to know the big ideas. Okay, so some big ideas for photosynthesis is going to be this overall reaction. Okay, some other big ideas of photosynthesis is going to be the light-dependent reactions. This is going to be an important slide here. You need to know what goes in, what comes out, and where it's happening. When it comes to your light-independent reactions, once again, you need to know what goes in, what comes out, and where it's happening. And you're going to also need to know just some generals about, some alternatives. You need to know generals like why do plants need water, okay? Things like that. So I hope this made sense. I know it's not the easiest lesson, but if you kind of take it a little bit at a time, and if you've already learned something from cellular respiration, it really shouldn't be too bad. I hope you guys have a great day, and hopefully we'll see you soon.